The box arrived at 10:30, delivered by a footman in the Duke of Winston's livery, midnight blue with silver facings that caught the weak December light streaming through the drawing-room windows. The velvet case was the size of a prayer book, but infinitely heavier, and when the servant placed it on the hall table, Isabella Shaw heard her mother's breath catch in a sound between a gasp and a prayer. "Isabella," her mother whispered, hands fluttering toward the box, but not quite touching it, as though the thing might burn. "Do you see the crest? Do you see it?" Isabella stood in the doorway of the morning room, teacup balanced in one hand, her morning correspondence forgotten on the escritoire behind her. She saw it. The Winston crest, pressed into black wax with a heavy seal, a constellation of stars surrounding a ducal coronet. Every household in London recognized that mark. It meant power. It meant money beyond comprehension. It meant the Duke himself had taken notice. Her mother's trembling fingers lifted the lid. The diamonds caught the light like a winter constellation. The Winston star, legendary, priceless, worn by every Duchess of Winston for 2 centuries. Not a gift, a declaration, a claim. "Good heavens," her mother breathed. "Isabella, do you understand what this means?" Isabella set down her teacup with careful precision. "It means," she said quietly, "that His Grace mistakes me for something I am not." The silence that followed felt like the held breath before a storm. "I beg your pardon?" Her mother's voice had gone dangerously soft. "The necklace is beautiful, Mama. It is also a contract I did not negotiate and have no intention of accepting." Isabella moved into the room, her morning dress rustling softly. "I will not be purchased, not even with diamonds." "Purchased? This is the Duke of Winston. Do you have any conception, Martha?" Her father appeared in the doorway, newspaper folded under his arm, his expression carefully neutral in the way that meant he was deeply concerned. "Perhaps we should hear Isabella's reasoning before." "Her reasoning?" Her mother's voice climbed. What reasoning could possibly justify refusing the most powerful man in England? Isabella crossed to the velvet box and studied the necklace with the same detached assessment she might give a piece of interesting architecture. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Each diamond had been cut to catch and multiply the light, creating the illusion of stars against the darkness of midnight. It was a masterpiece. It was also a shackle, however beautiful the metal. "He has never spoken to me," Isabella said, her voice calm and measured. "Not once in 3 seasons has the Duke of Winston deigned to acknowledge my existence at any assembly, any ball, any social gathering where we have both been present. Yet now he sends me the most recognizable piece of jewelry in England, worn by generations of his family's duchesses, and I am meant to understand this as a compliment?" Her mother's face had gone quite pale. "It is the highest compliment imaginable. It is a signal of intent, Isabella. Every woman in London will know by nightfall that the Duke has chosen." "Exactly." Isabella turned from the necklace to face her mother directly. "Every woman in London will know. That is precisely the point, is it not? This is not a private gesture of admiration. It is a public announcement of ownership. He has decided I will suit his purposes, and rather than court me, rather than learn anything of my character or preferences, he sends a fortune in jewels to mark me as his selection." "You are being absurd," her mother said, though her voice had begun to waver. "This is how such things are done among the highest ranks. The Duke cannot possibly court every young lady in the conventional manner. His position requires nothing of me." Isabella moved to her father's writing desk and withdrew a single sheet of cream-colored paper. Her hand was steady as she dipped the pen in ink. I did not ask for his notice. I do not want his diamonds. And I will not be claimed like a prize mare at Tattersall's simply because he has decided the time has come to secure an heir. Isabella, please. Her father's voice was gentle but edged with genuine concern. I understand your principles, my dear. Truly I do. But you must consider the consequences of refusing such a man. The Duke of Winston is not accustomed to being denied. His influence extends to every corner of society. If you offend him, then I offend him. Isabella's pen moved across the paper in swift, elegant strokes. I would rather face his displeasure than spend my life as an ornament in his collection, valued for my bloodline and my ability to wear his family's jewels without embarrassing him at state dinners. Her mother sank into the nearest chair, one hand pressed to her forehead. You will ruin us. You will ruin yourself. No other gentleman of consequence will dare approach you once it is known you refused the Duke of Winston. Good, Isabella said simply. She blotted the note, folded it with precise corners, and sealed it with her father's plain wax. No crest, no pretension, just honest sealing wax the color of dried blood. Then I shall be left in peace to live my life on my own terms. She crossed to the velvet box, placed the folded note atop the glittering necklace, and closed the lid with a soft, final click. The footman still waited in the hall, his face carefully blank in the way of all good servants who witnessed their betters' private dramas. Please return this to his grace, Isabella said, handing him the box with perfect composure. With my compliments and my sincere regrets. The footman's eyes widened fractionally, the only sign of his shock, before he bowed and accepted the box. Yes, miss. I shall deliver it at once. When the door closed behind him, Isabella's mother released a sound that might have been a sob or a strangled laugh. What have you done? Isabella, what have you done? Isabella returned to her abandoned teacup, now gone cold, and met her mother's horrified gaze with perfect calm. I have told the most powerful man in England that I am not for sale. Not for diamonds, not for titles, not for anything. She left the room before her mother could find her voice again, climbing the stairs to her chamber with measured steps. Behind her, she heard her father's low murmur, attempting to soothe his wife's rising panic. But Isabella felt no panic. She felt, for the first time in 3 tedious seasons, entirely certain of her own mind. Through her window, London's winter rooftops stretched gray and infinite. Somewhere across the city, in his Mayfair mansion, the Duke of Winston would soon receive his returned treasure and her curt refusal. Isabella wondered, with a small, defiant smile, what the most powerful man in England would do when told, for perhaps the first time in his life, that his power was not enough. Before we continue with what happens when the Duke receives his rejected gift, I need to know something. Are you Team Isabella or Team Roderick right now? If you're already invested in whether Isabella made the right choice, if you're curious what a furious Duke does when told no for the first time in his life, then please, please, hit that like button. It takes you half a second, but it tells YouTube this story deserves to reach other romance lovers who are scrolling right past it. And subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because I promise you, the confrontation scene is worth it. Don't let the algorithm bury this before you find out if they end up together. Now, let's see how the most powerful man in England handles rejection. Roderick Ashford, Duke of Winston, was reviewing his steward's quarterly reports when the footman returned. He noticed the velvet box immediately, recognized it, in fact, with the kind of certainty that comes from seeing a thing precisely where it should not be. The Winston star belonged around the neck of his future duchess, not cradled in a servant's white-gloved hands like some rejected gift from an overeager suitor. He set down his pen with deliberate care. Explain. The footman, to his credit, maintained his composure, though a faint sheen of perspiration had appeared on his brow. The young lady asked me to return this to your grace, along with her compliments and regrets. The words hung in the air of the study like something obscene. Roderick stared at the box, then at the footman, then back at the box. His mind struggled to arrange the information into any configuration that made sense. Return it? She had returned it? Her compliments and regrets, Roderick repeated slowly, as though testing the words for hidden meaning. Nothing else? There is a note, Your Grace. The footman stepped forward and placed the box on the mahogany desk with the reverence usually reserved for relics. Inside. Roderick dismissed him with a curt nod, waiting until the door clicked shut before reaching for the velvet case. His hands, he noticed with distant irritation, were not entirely steady. He had sent the Winston star to 3 women in his life: his mother on the occasion of her betrothal, his sister when she married the Earl of Pembroke, and now to Miss Isabella Shaw, whom he had selected after careful consideration as the future Duchess of Winston. The note was brief, written in an elegant hand that suggested education and breeding. Your Grace, I am sensible of the honor you do me, but I cannot accept a gift of such significance. The Winston star belongs to your family's history, not to a lady with whom you have never exchanged a single word of conversation. I must respectfully decline. With sincere regards, Miss Isabella Shaw. Roderick read it once. Then again, then a third time, as though repetition might somehow alter the meaning of the words. Each reading brought a fresh wave of something he had not experienced in so long. He almost failed to recognize it. Fury, not the hot, impulsive anger of youth, but the cold, crystalline rage of a man whose authority had been questioned in a manner so unprecedented he had no protocol for addressing it. He rose from his desk and moved to the window overlooking his Mayfair garden, the note still clutched in his hand. She had declined. Respectfully, politely, with impeccable grammar and penmanship, but declined nonetheless. The audacity of it was breathtaking. Did she not understand what the Winston star represented? Did she not comprehend that women of far greater consequence than herself would have wept with gratitude to receive such a token? A lady with whom you have never exchanged a single word of conversation. The accusation in that line struck him like a physical blow, as though conversation were a prerequisite for such matters, as though the Duke of Winston were expected to engage in idle chatter with every potential bride before making his selection known. He had observed her, had he not? Had noted her excellent posture, her appropriate conduct, her family's respectable if modest standing. He had made inquiries through his aunt, who reported that Miss Shaw was well-read, even-tempered, and free of scandal. What more conversation could possibly be necessary? The selection of a duchess was a matter of state, not sentiment. The woman who bore his name and his children would occupy one of the most significant positions in English society. She required breeding, composure, and the ability to manage great households without descending into hysteria or frivolity. From his observations, Miss Isabella Shaw possessed all of these qualities, and she had sent back the Winston star. Roderick's grip tightened on the note, crumpling the expensive paper. The refusal was not merely personal, it was public. His footman had witnessed it. Miss Shaw's parents had witnessed it. By now, their servants would know, and by tomorrow, half of London would be whispering about the young lady who had dared refuse the Duke of Winston's unmistakable signal of intent. The damage to his reputation would be considerable. He was already the subject of endless speculation. The wealthiest unmarried peer in England, a man whose every action was scrutinized and dissected by society's gossips. For years he had ignored the pointed remarks about his duty to the dukedom, the barely veiled suggestions that his continued bachelorhood was somehow a dereliction of responsibility. He had waited because he refused to be rushed into a decision of such magnitude, had taken his time to observe and consider and select the most appropriate candidate. And she had returned his family's most sacred symbol, with a note suggesting he should have conversed with her first. The presumption of it ignited something dangerous in his chest. Did Miss Isabella Shaw imagine herself so far above her station that she could dictate terms to a duke? Did she believe her minor fortune and respectable connections gave her the luxury of refusing the most advantageous match she could ever hope to make? He crossed to his desk and reached for the bell pull, then stopped. His first impulse was to send his secretary with a sharply worded letter, something that would make clear the magnitude of her error and the consequences of such public disrespect. But even as the thought formed, he dismissed it. No, a letter would not suffice. Letters could be misinterpreted, ignored, or worse, shown to others as evidence of his displeasure, which would only feed the gossip and make him appear petty. If Miss Isabella Shaw wanted conversation, he would give her conversation. He would go to her himself and demand an explanation for this extraordinary breach of propriety. The decision, once made, brought a grim satisfaction. He would call on her tomorrow morning, early enough to catch her household off guard. He would ask her directly, face to face, why she had seen fit to insult him and his family with this unprecedented refusal. And he would make it abundantly clear that such behavior, however charmingly phrased in expensive stationery, was entirely unacceptable. Roderick returned the crumpled note to the velvet box and closed the lid. The Winston star glittered accusingly in the lamplight, a constellation of diamonds that had adorned the throats of women who understood their duty and their privilege. Tomorrow, Miss Isabella Shaw would learn that refusing the Duke of Winston was not a matter of polite regret and sincere regards. It was a mistake she would have ample opportunity to reconsider. He rang for his secretary. "Prepare the carriage for tomorrow morning, first light. I will be paying a call on the Shaw residence in Bloomsbury." "Of course, Your Grace." "Should I send advance notice?" "No," Roderick said quietly, his voice carrying the particular tone that made even his most senior servants straighten their spines. "I believe the element of surprise will serve me better." The Duke of Winston's carriage arrived in Bloomsbury at precisely 8 o'clock on Christmas Eve morning, and its appearance had much the same effect as a warship sailing into a fishing village. The midnight blue lacquer gleamed in the weak winter sun. The Winston crest emblazoned on the door in silver and gold leaf that caught the light with ostentatious brilliance. 4 matched greys stamped and snorted in the cold air, their breath creating clouds of vapor that drifted past the modest brick townhouses like harbingers of something momentous. Roderick descended before his footman could fully lower the steps, his greatcoat swirling around his boots as he strode toward the Shaw residence. He was aware of the curtains twitching in neighboring windows, the sudden appearance of housemaids who had found urgent reason to sweep already clean stoops. Let them watch, let them whisper. By noon, all of Bloomsbury would know that the Duke of Winston had called upon Miss Isabella Shaw, and the speculation would spread like wildfire through London's drawing rooms. The Shaw butler answered his knock with admirable composure, though his eyes widened fractionally at the sight of the ducal crest on Roderick's card. "Your Grace, if you will please wait in the entrance hall. I shall inquire if Miss Shaw is receiving." "She will receive me," Roderick said, stepping past him into the narrow hallway with the absolute certainty of a man unaccustomed to being denied entry anywhere. "Immediately." The drawing room into which he was shown moments later was small but tastefully appointed, the furnishings quality pieces that spoke of comfort rather than ostentation. Morning light filtered through curtains of pale blue silk, illuminating a room that was unmistakably feminine without descending into frivolity. Books lined one wall, actual books, their spines creased from reading rather than serving as decorative props. He had perhaps 3 minutes to absorb these details before the door opened and Isabella Shaw entered. Roderick had seen her before, of course, had observed her at Lady Pemberton's ball, at the Worthington Musicale, at a dozen other gatherings where he had made his careful assessments. But he had never been in a room alone with her, had never stood close enough to note the precise shade of her eyes, gray like winter dawn, or the way her dark hair caught auburn lights in the morning sun. She wore a simple morning dress of deep green wool, appropriate for the season and the hour. And she met his gaze with a directness that was either admirably bold or shockingly improper. "Your Grace," she said, executing a curtsy that was correct to the inch, but somehow lacked any suggestion of deference. "This is unexpected." "Is it?" Roderick remained standing, aware that his height and position in the center of the room gave him a tactical advantage. "You returned the Winston star with a curt note, and you imagine I would simply accept such a dismissal without demanding an explanation?" A faint crease appeared between her brows. "I had not imagined you would consider my decision worthy of a personal visit. Surely a duke has more pressing matters to attend on Christmas Eve." "I have no more pressing matter," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "than understanding why you saw fit to publicly refuse the greatest honor I could bestow." She closed the door behind her, an action that was either refreshingly practical or alarmingly improper. He could not decide which, and moved to stand near the fireplace. The morning light caught the clean lines of her profile, the determined set of her jaw. "I did not refuse an honor, Your Grace. I refused a transaction." "A transaction?" He repeated the word as though it tasted of something bitter. "You consider the Winston star, worn by generations of my family's duchesses, to be a transaction? I consider sending a legendary piece of jewelry to a woman you have never spoken to, in lieu of actually courting her, to be a transaction, yes." Her voice remained perfectly level, but her eyes had begun to show hints of steel. "You made your selection. You announced your intention via expensive symbol. You expected compliance. That is the very definition of a transaction, Your Grace." The audacity of it struck him speechless for a moment. Women did not speak to him this way. No one spoke to him this way. He was accustomed to careful deference, to elaborate courtesy that bordered on obsequiousness. Even his equals among the peerage approached him with a degree of diplomatic caution, aware of his wealth and influence. "You believe I owe you courtship?" he asked, aware that his tone had turned glacial. That the Duke of Winston should engage in the same trivial rituals as some second son hoping to secure a modest fortune? "I believe," Isabella said, turning to face him fully, "that if you wish to marry a woman, you might at least have the courtesy to learn her name before sending her your family's heirlooms. I know your name, Isabella Marguerite Shaw, daughter of Harold and Martha Shaw of Lincolnshire. 22 years of age, 3 seasons, no scandal, adequate education, appropriate connections." "My favorite color is blue," she interrupted quietly. "The shade of the sky just after dawn. I prefer Wordsworth to Byron, though I would never admit it in fashionable company, because it marks me as unfashionably sincere. I cannot abide the taste of quail, but I eat it at every formal dinner because refusing would be rude. I have read Wollstonecraft and Smith and believe that women should be educated to the same standard as men. And until this moment, Your Grace, I had never heard your voice except at a distance, pronouncing judgments or issuing commands to your servants. Roderick stared at her, his prepared arguments scattering like leaves in a wind. Wollstonecraft. She had read Mary Wollstonecraft. The admission was either breathtakingly honest or calculatedly designed to intrigue him. He could not determine which. These details, he said slowly, are hardly relevant to the suitability of a duchess. Are they not? Isabella took a step toward him, and he was struck by the intensity in her eyes, the intelligence that radiated from her like heat from a flame. Then what is relevant, Your Grace? My bloodline? My ability to wear diamonds without disgracing you? My willingness to produce heirs and manage your households while you attend to matters of actual importance? Those duties, Roderick said stiffly, are not insignificant. I did not say they were. I said they were the duties of a transaction, not a marriage. Her voice softened fractionally, though the steel remained. I will not be purchased, Your Grace. Not with diamonds, not with titles, not with the promise of becoming one of the most powerful women in England. I am not for sale. The silence that followed felt charged with something electric, dangerous. Roderick found himself studying her with the same intensity he usually reserved for complex estate documents or political strategy. Her refusal was not the petulant rebellion of a spoiled girl hoping to increase her value through artificial scarcity. It was principle, genuinely held and fearlessly defended. It was, he realized with a shock of recognition, admirable. You are remarkably blunt, Miss Shaw, he said finally. I am honest, Your Grace. There is a difference, though I understand the two are rarely distinguished in society. She met his gaze without flinching. You came here demanding an explanation for my refusal. I have given you one. If you find it insufficient or impertinent, I can only apologize for wasting your valuable time. Roderick moved toward her, closing the distance between them until he could see the faint gold flecks in her gray eyes, could detect the subtle acceleration of her breathing that suggested she was not as composed as she appeared. You have not wasted my time, Miss Shaw. You have surprised me. That is a considerably rarer commodity. Then I am glad to have provided you with novelty, if nothing else. He almost smiled. Almost. You are either very brave or very foolish. Perhaps I am both. Isabella lifted her chin slightly. But I am also very certain. I will not marry without affection, Your Grace. I will not enter into a union where I am valued solely for my utility. And I will not apologize for refusing a gift that was never truly a gift at all, but an announcement of ownership. The words should have infuriated him. Instead, they ignited something else entirely. A curiosity sharp as hunger. A desire to understand this woman who stood before him like a fortress of principle in a simple green dress. Very well, Miss Shaw, he said quietly. You have made your position clear. He turned toward the door, then paused, looking back at her over his shoulder. I wonder, though, if you are as certain as you claim. I assure you, Your Grace, I am entirely— Then prove it, he interrupted. Attend my Christmas house party at Winston Abbey, not as my intended bride, but as my guest. Allow me 1 week to demonstrate that I am more than the arrogant duke of your imagination. Her eyes widened fractionally. That is hardly— 1 week, Miss Shaw. If at the end you still believe I see you merely as a transaction, I will accept your refusal and never trouble you again. He smiled then, a dangerous expression that held both challenge and promise. Unless, of course, you are afraid. The challenge hung between them like a sword suspended by silk thread. Isabella felt her pulse quicken. though whether from indignation or something more dangerous, she could not say. The Duke stood framed in the doorway with the confidence of a man who had never been refused anything twice, and the faint smile on his lips suggested he knew precisely the effect his words would have. "I am not afraid of you, Your Grace," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "Then you are afraid of yourself?" He turned fully back toward her, abandoning the pretense of departure. "Afraid that you might discover I am neither the tyrant nor the merchant you have imagined me to be. I have imagined you nothing at all. I have merely observed your actions and drawn reasonable conclusions. Conclusions based on a single gesture, interpreted through the lens of your own assumptions." Roderick moved back into the room, but this time he chose a chair near the fireplace, settling into it with casual grace that somehow made the modest furniture seem like a throne. "You accuse me of making judgments without conversation, Miss Shaw, yet you have done precisely the same." The observation struck with uncomfortable accuracy. Isabella remained standing, unwilling to cede the advantage of height, even as she recognized the weakness of her position. "You sent me a necklace worn by duchesses." The message was hardly subtle. The message was sincere. He leaned back, studying her with an intensity that made her feel like a ledger being audited. "Though I begin to see it was also insufficient. You require more than symbols, Miss Shaw. You require substance. I require to be seen as more than a vessel for heirs and a hostess for state dinners. Then come to Winston Abbey and allow me to see you." The casual tone had vanished, replaced by something that sounded almost like earnestness. Not as a prospective bride on display for society's approval, but as something far more valuable. Isabella felt a flutter of curiosity despite herself. And what might that be? "An advisor." He said it simply, as though proposing something perfectly ordinary rather than scandalous. "I have need of counsel on matters regarding my estates, particularly concerning the tenant families and the proposed reforms I am considering. You strike me as a woman of considerable intelligence and strong principles. I would value your honest opinion on these matters." She stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You wish me to advise you on estate management?" "I wish you to see what a duchess actually does beyond wearing jewelry and producing heirs." A hint of irritation had crept into his voice. "The Duchess of Winston holds one of the most influential positions in England. She oversees properties that house hundreds of families. She makes decisions that affect entire communities. She wields power that most men could only envy. But you are correct. It is also a transaction if entered without understanding or partnership." Isabella moved to the chair opposite him, slowly, as though approaching something that might startle and flee. "You are proposing that I come to your home, unchaperoned, to discuss estate business like some sort of steward?" "Hardly unchaperoned. The house will be full of servants, and I will ensure your mother accompanies you if you wish, though I suspect her presence would undermine the purpose." He paused, then added with devastating honesty, "I had planned a Christmas house party with 24 guests, all carefully selected to provide appropriate social context for our courtship. I will cancel every invitation if you agree to come instead." The magnitude of the offer rendered her momentarily speechless. A duke's Christmas party was a social event of tremendous significance. Canceling it would cause scandal, disappointment, and endless speculation. "You would create such upheaval simply to prove a point?" "I would create such upheaval to have an honest conversation with a woman who interests me far more than an entire ballroom of simpering debutantes." The bluntness of the statement seemed to surprise even him, and he looked briefly away, toward the weak fire struggling in the grate. "You said I have never spoken to you, Miss Shaw." You are correct. I observed you and made assumptions based on reputation and appearance. It is how such matters are typically conducted. But I am beginning to suspect that typical approaches will not suffice with you. Isabella found herself gripping the arms of her chair, as though the furniture might anchor her against the vertiginous sensation of the world tilting. What you propose is highly irregular. Yes. Society would consider it scandalous. Undoubtedly. My reputation would be irreparably damaged if the true nature of such a visit became known, which is why it will be presented as an extended Christmas visit, chaperoned by your mother, at the invitation of my aunt, the Dowager Duchess, who will conveniently appear for that very purpose. He met her eyes with an expression that was part challenge, part plea. I am offering you precisely what you claim to want, Miss Shaw. A conversation. An opportunity to know my character beyond my title and wealth. A chance to see what partnership with me might actually entail. And if, at the end of this week, I still refuse you, then I will accept your decision and never approach you again. You will have my word as a gentleman and a duke. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his posture informal in a way that seemed almost foreign to his usual rigid bearing. But I will have had the satisfaction of knowing you rejected me based on knowledge rather than assumption. The proposal was mad. It was improper. It was exactly the sort of scheme that could ruin her entirely if it went wrong. And yet, Isabella felt the familiar stirring of curiosity that had always been both her greatest asset and her most dangerous liability. Here was the Duke of Winston, arguably the most powerful peer in England, offering to cancel his social obligations and open his private affairs to her scrutiny, simply because she had dared to refuse him. It was either the most arrogant manipulation she had ever encountered, or it was genuine. You mentioned tenant reforms, she said slowly, testing the waters. What manner of reforms? Something flickered in his eyes. Triumph, perhaps, or relief. The cottages require modernization. Proper roofs, improved drainage, larger windows. The cost is substantial, and my steward argues it is unnecessary extravagance. I believe it is moral obligation. I would value a perspective unburdened by financial considerations. Your steward sounds short-sighted. My steward sounds like every other estate manager in England, concerned with profit margins rather than human welfare. Roderick's voice had taken on an edge of frustration. But implementing such changes requires navigating complex social and economic considerations. I have power, Miss Shaw, but power without wisdom is mere tyranny. Isabella felt her resistance crumbling like frost under sudden sun. He was offering her exactly what she had claimed to want: intellectual engagement, meaningful purpose, honest conversation. And if his motives were ultimately selfish, if this was merely an elaborate courtship strategy, would that make the opportunity less valuable? 1 week, she said finally. I will come to Winston Abbey for 1 week, with my mother as chaperone. I will offer you my honest opinions on your estate matters. But I make no promises beyond that, Your Grace. If at any point I feel I am being manipulated or treated as a decorative accessory rather than a thinking person, I will leave immediately. Agreed. He stood, and she rose as well, finding herself uncomfortably aware of his height, the breadth of his shoulders, the intensity of his focus when it settled entirely upon her. We depart for Winston Abbey tomorrow afternoon. I will send my carriage. That is Christmas Day. Yes. We will celebrate it properly at the Abbey. He moved toward the door, then paused. One more condition, Miss Shaw. Her defenses rose immediately. Yes? When we are private, discussing estate matters as colleagues. Rather than duke and subject, you will call me Roderick. and I will call you Isabella. I cannot have honest counsel from someone who addresses me as Your Grace every other sentence. The intimacy of the suggestion should have scandalized her. Instead, she found herself nodding. Very well. Roderick. Her name in his mouth sounded strange, deliberate, as though he were tasting something new. Isabella. After he left, she stood alone in the drawing room for several minutes, listening to the commotion his departure created in the street outside. She had just agreed to spend Christmas week alone, relatively speaking, with the Duke of Winston, discussing estate management like some sort of gentleman's scholar rather than a lady awaiting courtship. It was either the wisest or most foolish decision of her life. She suspected she would not know which until it was far too late to change course. Winston Abbey rose from the Derbyshire landscape like something from a Gothic romance, all ancient stone and soaring towers, softened by a fresh dusting of Christmas snow. Isabella watched it grow larger through the carriage window as they approached along the tree-lined drive, and felt her resolve waver for the first time since accepting Roderick's challenge. The sheer scale of the place was intimidating. Not merely a house, but a monument to centuries of accumulated power and privilege. Good heavens, her mother whispered beside her, hand fluttering to her throat in a gesture that had become habitual since the Duke's carriage had arrived that afternoon. Isabella, we are so far beyond our sphere. We were invited, Mama, Isabella said with more confidence than she felt. We have as much right to be here as anyone. But as the carriage rolled to a stop before the massive entrance portico, she wondered if that was entirely true. A small army of servants materialized to handle their modest luggage, and Isabella was keenly aware of how provincial their traveling cases appeared against the backdrop of such magnificence. The Dowager Duchess met them in the grand entrance hall, a silver-haired woman whose keen eyes missed nothing as she executed her role as nominal chaperone with aristocratic precision. Mrs. Shaw, welcome to Winston Abbey. I trust your journey was pleasant? The introductions were accomplished with flawless courtesy, though Isabella detected curiosity beneath the dowager's polished manners. How much did she know about the true purpose of this visit? Had Roderick confided in her, or was she simply playing her part in whatever social theater he had orchestrated? Roderick himself appeared as they were being shown to their rooms, descending the main staircase with the casual authority of a man entirely at home in his surroundings. He was dressed less formally than he had been in London, his coat well-tailored but understated. And Isabella found herself noticing details she had missed before. The slight wave in his dark hair, the calluses on his hands that suggested he did more than merely sign documents from a distance. Miss Shaw, he said, his tone perfectly neutral. I trust you find your accommodations satisfactory. We dine at 8, but I wonder if you might join me in the library at 6 for a preliminary discussion of the estate matters I mentioned. It was masterfully done. To anyone observing, it would seem merely an eccentric duke consulting a guest on some minor matter. But Isabella saw the careful choreography in it, the way he had positioned their meeting as business rather than courtship, protecting her reputation even as he bent every social convention. Of course, Your Grace, she replied, matching his formality. I should be happy to offer whatever assistance I can. Her mother looked between them with barely concealed confusion. But the dowager simply smiled and swept Mrs. Shaw away with talk of the evening's menu and the Abbey's famous portrait gallery. The library, when Isabella found it at precisely 6 o'clock, was nothing like the ostentatious display spaces she had seen in other great houses. This was a working collection, floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with volumes whose spines showed the wear of actual reading. A fire blazed in the massive hearth, and Roderick stood before it, studying a leather-bound ledger with the intensity of a general reviewing battle plans. He looked up as she entered, and something in his expression shifted, tension releasing, perhaps, or defenses lowering now that they were private. "Isabella, thank you for coming." The use of her given name sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "You made it rather difficult to refuse, Roderick." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. That was rather the point. He gestured to a large mahogany table where several documents had been laid out, weighted down with what appeared to be ancient stone paperweights. "These are the current tenant agreements for the Winston estates. I would value your opinion on their terms." Isabella moved to the table, genuinely curious now. The documents were written in the dense legal language typical of such contracts. But as she began to read, her eyebrows rose steadily higher. "These terms are medieval." Precisely my assessment. The rents are set at rates that assume crop yields from decades ago. The maintenance obligations fall entirely on the tenants, even for structural repairs that are clearly the landlord's responsibility. And this clause about eviction. She looked up at him, genuinely shocked. "You could remove families with 30 days' notice for infractions as minor as keeping a dog without permission?" "Technically, yes." Roderick's voice had gone quiet, almost ashamed. "Though I have never enforced such measures. But the fact that I could, that the power exists in these documents." He trailed off, moving to pour 2 glasses of sherry without asking if she wanted one. "It troubles me deeply." Isabella accepted the glass, studying him with new interest. Most landlords would consider such power their right and privilege. Most landlords do not lie awake at night, imagining what it must feel like to live at the mercy of someone else's whims. He took a long drink, then set the glass down with more force than necessary. "I inherited this title at 19, Isabella. My father died in a hunting accident, and suddenly I was responsible for 30,000 acres, 12 major properties, and the lives of hundreds of families I had never even met. Do you know what I was told when I questioned these contracts?" She shook her head, transfixed by the raw honesty in his voice. "I was told that the tenants were fortunate to have such generous terms, that other estates demanded far more, that I should concern myself with the business of being a duke and leave such details to my steward." His laugh was bitter, as though cruelty becomes acceptable simply because others practice worse cruelty. Isabella set down her own glass and returned to the documents, this time reading with purpose rather than mere curiosity. "You want to rewrite them." "I want to create partnerships rather than dictatorships. Fair rents tied to actual yields. Shared responsibility for maintenance based on a clear division of structural versus cosmetic needs. Security of tenure that cannot be arbitrarily revoked." He came to stand beside her, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and old books that clung to him. "But such changes will cost a fortune in lost revenue and create chaos among my peers, who will view it as dangerous radicalism." "It is dangerous radicalism," Isabella said, feeling excitement kindle in her chest. "It is also morally correct." She pulled one of the documents closer, her mind already working through implications and possibilities. "Have you considered offering long-term leases rather than year-to-year tenancies? If families knew they had security for 20 or 30 years, they would invest more in improvements, which benefits everyone. My steward claims no tenant could be trusted with such security. Your steward is a fool." The words escaped before she could moderate them. But when she glanced up at Roderick, she found him smiling, a genuine smile that transformed his entire face from austere to almost boyish. "I knew you would understand," he said quietly. Everyone else treats me either with obsequious agreement or patronizing dismissal, as though my concerns were the naive idealism of someone too privileged to understand practical realities. But you, he stopped, seeming to struggle with words. You see what I see. That power without justice is tyranny, regardless of how gilded the cage. Isabella felt something shift between them, a recognition deeper than mere attraction. You feel trapped by all this? She gestured at the room, the estate, the weight of centuries pressing down around them. The title, the expectations, the role you are required to perform. Every day of my life. The admission seemed torn from somewhere deep within him. I am the Duke of Winston. I have more wealth than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, more power than most men dream of. And I am profoundly, utterly alone, in a castle full of servants and sycophants who would agree with me if I declared the sky green. The loneliness in his voice was so raw it made her chest ache. She reached out without thinking, her hand settling on his arm. You are not alone right now. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face, and Isabella saw vulnerability there that had nothing to do with estate management or tenant rights. This was the man beneath the title, the person who existed beyond the duchy and the power and the ancient name. This was Roderick, who had sent her diamonds because he did not know how else to express interest, who had canceled a house party because she had challenged him to be genuine, who stayed awake at night worrying about families he had never met. No, he said softly, his hand covering hers where it rested on his sleeve. I am not alone right now. They stood like that for a moment that stretched and deepened, the library seeming to contract around them until nothing existed but the warmth of the fire and the weight of shared understanding. Then Isabella carefully withdrew her hand, though the loss of contact felt like something physical. Show me the cottage plans, she said, her voice not quite steady. If we are to revolutionize your estate management, we should start with housing. Roderick's smile this time held gratitude and something warmer. As my advisor commands. They worked until the dinner bell rang, heads bent together over documents and diagrams, and Isabella realized with a start that she had not thought once about marriage or courtship or social positioning. She had simply talked with someone who saw the world as she did, who valued justice over tradition and conscience over convenience. It was, she thought as she reluctantly left for dinner, far more dangerous than any courtship could ever be. The arrival of the house guests shattered the careful intimacy that had begun to form between Isabella and Roderick like a stone through glass. Isabella woke the morning after their library conversation to find Winston Abbey transformed from a private sanctuary into a stage set for society's most elaborate performance. Carriages began rolling up the drive before noon, disgorging passengers in clouds of expensive perfume and entitlement. The dowager had apparently sent hastily revised invitations to a select few guests, creating a skeleton house party that would provide social cover for Isabella's presence while avoiding the full spectacle Roderick had threatened to cancel. It was a compromise that satisfied propriety while maintaining the unconventional arrangement at the heart of their agreement. Isabella watched the arrivals from her window with growing apprehension. She recognized several faces from her London seasons. Lord and Lady Ashworth, the Honorable Mr. Fitzwilliam, the pompous Sir Edmund Carstairs, who had once lectured her for 20 minutes about the superiority of his hunting dogs. And then, descending from a carriage lacquered in fashionable cream and gold, Lady Vivian Northcliffe. Even from a distance, Lady Vivian was breathtaking. Golden hair arranged in elaborate curls, a traveling dress of sapphire blue that must have cost more than Isabella's entire wardrobe, and the kind of self-assured grace that came from a lifetime of being admired. Isabella had met her briefly during her second season and had disliked her immediately, not from jealousy, but from the calculated coldness beneath Vivian's practiced charm. "That is trouble," her mother murmured, appearing at Isabella's shoulder. "Lady Vivian has been angling for the Duke since her come out. Everyone assumed it was simply a matter of time before he made an offer." Isabella felt an unexpected twist of something uncomfortably close to jealousy. Then perhaps she will be pleased to finally have her opportunity. But even as she said it, she knew it was not true. Whatever was developing between herself and Roderick had nothing to do with the marriage market's usual calculations, and everything to do with those quiet hours in the library discussing justice and loneliness and the weight of inherited power. The afternoon gathering in the drawing room was excruciating. Lady Vivian had positioned herself at the center of the assembled company like a queen holding court. Her laugh musical and perfectly timed, her attention on Roderick unmistakable in its intention. She greeted Isabella with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Miss Shaw, what a delightful surprise to find you here. I had not realized you were acquainted with His Grace." The emphasis on the last words was subtle but unmistakable, a reminder that Isabella existed outside the Duke's usual social sphere. "His Grace was kind enough to include my mother and myself in his Christmas celebrations," Isabella replied evenly. "We are most grateful for his hospitality." "How generous of him." Vivian's gaze traveled over Isabella's dress, a perfectly respectable gown of bronze silk that suddenly felt provincial under such scrutiny. "And what brings you to Derbyshire? Family connections in the area, perhaps?" "Actually, Lady Vivian, I invited Miss Shaw specifically to consult on certain estate matters," Roderick said, appearing at Isabella's elbow with 2 glasses of champagne. "She has proven invaluable in her insights." The silence that followed was profound. Isabella watched calculation flicker behind Vivian's beautiful eyes as she processed this information, trying to determine what threat Isabella might actually pose. "Estate matters," Vivian repeated, her tone suggesting she had just been told Isabella consulted on arrangements for the poultry yard. "How extraordinarily progressive of you, Your Grace. Though I confess I cannot imagine what expertise Miss Shaw might offer that your stewards and agents could not provide." "Miss Shaw offers honesty," Roderick said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that made several nearby conversations falter. "A commodity considerably rarer than expertise." Isabella felt warmth spread through her chest at his defense, even as she recognized the danger it represented. Vivian's smile had frozen into something brittle and sharp. "How fascinating," Vivian said. "You must tell me all about these estate matters at dinner, Miss Shaw. I am utterly captivated by the idea of a young lady advising on such complex, masculine concerns." The dinner she referenced proved to be a masterclass in subtle warfare. Vivian had somehow arranged the seating to place herself at Roderick's right hand, with Isabella relegated to a position several seats down between Sir Edmund and a deaf elderly gentleman who communicated primarily in grunts. Throughout the meal, Vivian dominated the conversation with witty observations about their mutual acquaintances, references to events and people Isabella had no knowledge of, and carefully crafted reminders of the vast social distance between a duke and a gentleman's daughter from Lincolnshire. "Tell me, Miss Shaw," Vivian said during a lull in the conversation, her voice carrying clearly down the table. "I understand your father made his fortune in... what was it? Something to do with mills?" It was a lie, delivered with perfect innocence. Harold Shaw had inherited his modest estate. There was no fortune, no mills, no taint of trade. But the suggestion alone was designed to mark Isabella as nouveau riche, as someone whose presence at such a table represented charity rather than belonging. Isabella felt every eye turned toward her, saw her mother's face pale with anxiety. She could deny it, explain the truth, scramble to defend her family's respectability. Instead, she smiled and took a deliberate sip of her wine. Actually, Lady Vivian, my father's fortune comes primarily from investing wisely and living modestly, concepts that may seem foreign in such elevated circles, but which have served our family remarkably well. She set down her glass with perfect composure. Though I confess, had he made his money in mills, I should be quite proud of it. Honest labor seems infinitely more admirable than inherited wealth accompanied by inherited arrogance. Someone down the table, Mr. Fitzwilliam, she thought, made a choking sound that might have been suppressed laughter. Vivian's smile had become glacial. How refreshingly direct, Vivian said. I suppose such plain speaking is common in Lincolnshire society. It is common wherever people value truth over performance, Isabella replied. Though I understand that in some circles, performance is all that matters. Ladies, the Dowager interjected smoothly, though Isabella could have sworn she saw approval in the older woman's eyes. Perhaps we might discuss the Christmas Eve service. I understand the village church has been beautifully decorated this year. The conversation shifted, but Isabella felt Roderick's gaze on her like a physical touch. When she dared glance in his direction, she found him watching her with an expression that combined admiration and something warmer, more dangerous. After dinner, as the ladies withdrew and left the gentlemen to their port, Vivian cornered Isabella near the drawing-room fire. You are making a grave mistake, she said quietly, her beautiful face hard as marble. Whatever you imagine is developing between yourself and the Duke. I assure you, it is temporary amusement. Men like Roderick marry women like me, women who understand their world, who can navigate their society, who will not embarrass them with provincial honesty and naive idealism. Isabella met her gaze steadily. If that is what he wants, Lady Vivian, then you have nothing to fear from me. I fear nothing from you, Vivian said, but there was uncertainty beneath the declaration. You are a novelty, Miss Shaw. Nothing more. When the gentlemen rejoined them, Sir Edmund embarked on an interminable monologue about his recent acquisition of a prized stallion, complete with tedious details about bloodlines and stud fees that made even the Dowager's eyes glaze over. Isabella caught Roderick's gaze across the room and saw her own barely suppressed amusement mirrored there. He raised one eyebrow fractionally. Can you believe this fool? And she had to look away quickly before she laughed out loud. Later, as the party began to disperse toward bed, Roderick contrived to walk with her toward the main staircase, a gesture that could pass as simple courtesy but felt weighted with significance. You handled Vivian beautifully, he said quietly. I had not realized how cruel my own circle could be until I saw it directed at someone who did not deserve it. She is afraid, Isabella replied. Fear makes people cruel. She has no reason to fear you. They reached the base of the stairs, where propriety demanded they part. Unless she suspects what I am beginning to realize myself. Isabella's heart quickened. And what is that? He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unguarded in a way she had never seen in public. That the woman I thought I was selecting as a duchess bears no resemblance to the woman I am actually coming to know. And that the difference is everything. He bowed formally then and withdrew, leaving Isabella to climb the stairs alone with those words echoing in her mind, like a promise or a warning. She could not decide which. The gardens at Winston Abbey had been magnificent once. Isabella could see the ghosts of their former glory in the stone pathways half buried under moss, the marble statuary worn smooth by decades of weather, the elaborate fountain that no longer flowed. Roderick had brought her here on the afternoon of their third day, escaping the suffocating atmosphere of the house, where Vivian's presence seemed to poison every room. "My mother loved these gardens," he said, leading her down a path flanked by overgrown boxwood that had long since lost its formal shape. She spent every morning here, even in winter. After she died, my father could not bear to see them maintained. He let them fall to ruin rather than be reminded of her. Isabella pulled her cloak tighter against the December cold and studied the melancholy beauty of the neglected space. "How long ago did you lose her?" 15 years this past summer. His voice was quiet, distant. I was 14, old enough to understand what was happening, too young to do anything to prevent it. They walked in silence for a moment, their breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. Isabella had noticed that Roderick spoke of his father rarely, and always with a certain careful neutrality that suggested complicated feelings held firmly in check. "She was very unhappy," he continued, stopping before a stone bench where dead vines created a natural canopy overhead. "My father married her for her bloodline and her fortune. She married him because she had no choice. Her family was on the verge of financial collapse, and the Duke of Winston's proposal saved them from ruin." Isabella felt something cold settle in her chest. The Winston star. He looked at her sharply. "You guessed. You told me it was a symbol of intent, worn by every Duchess of Winston. But you sent it to me without ceremony, without courtship, much as your father must have sent it to your mother." She sat carefully on the bench, brushing away dead leaves. "A beautiful cage is still a cage, Roderick." He remained standing, his profile stark against the gray winter sky. "My mother told me the story when I was 12, before she became too ill to speak clearly. She said she wept when the Winston star arrived because she knew what it meant, that her life was no longer her own, that she would become property, however gilded the title. Why are you telling me this?" "Because I need you to understand why your refusal struck me so forcefully." He turned to face her, and Isabella saw anguish in his expression. "When you returned the necklace, my first reaction was rage. At the insult, at the audacity, at the unprecedented nature of the rejection. But underneath that rage was something else entirely. Relief." Isabella's breath caught. "Relief?" "Because you saw what my mother saw. The transaction, the coercion, the reduction of a woman to a strategic acquisition." He moved to sit beside her on the bench, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him despite the cold. "And you had the courage to refuse what she could not. You chose freedom over security, principle over position. You did what she wished she had been brave enough to do." The vulnerability in his admission made Isabella's throat tight. She must have been very strong to survive such a marriage. She was strong enough to love me despite everything. To make sure I understood that power without compassion was cruelty, regardless of how it was dressed up in tradition and duty. His hands were clenched on his knees, knuckles white. "She made me promise, near the end, that I would never treat my own wife as my father had treated her, that I would choose partnership over possession. And yet you sent me the Winston star." "And yet I sent you the Winston star," he echoed, his voice rough. "Because I am my father's son as much as my mother's. Because 30 years of training in ducal expectations does not evaporate simply because one makes a deathbed promise. Because I did not know how else to signal my interest to a woman I had observed but never spoken to." Isabella felt tears prick her eyes. "You were trying to honor your position and your promise simultaneously. I was trying to do my duty while convincing myself that selecting an appropriate bride based on observation and reputation was somehow different from what my father had done. He laughed bitterly. And then you refused me, and I realized I had become exactly what I most despised. Without thinking, Isabella reached for his hand, covering his clenched fist with her palm. You are nothing like your father, Roderick. A man like that would never have questioned his own behavior, never sought honest counsel, never admitted fault or vulnerability. He looked down at their joined hands, then slowly unclenched his fist, turning his hand over to thread his fingers through hers. The touch sent warmth radiating up her arm, intimate and electric in a way that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with genuine connection. I wanted to hate you, he said quietly. When you returned the necklace, when you stood in your drawing room and accused me of treating you as a transaction, I wanted to dismiss you as an ungrateful provincial who did not understand the honor being offered. But I could not, because everything you said was true, and I knew it. I did not want to intrigue you, Isabella admitted. I wanted only to be left alone, to avoid becoming another woman whose life was dictated by a man's convenience. But then you came to my house, furious and proud, and challenged me to see you as more than your title. And I find that I now cannot stop seeing you, Roderick. Not the Duke. You. He shifted on the bench, turning toward her fully, and suddenly they were very close. Isabella could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way his breath quickened as he studied her face with the same intensity he had once reserved for estate documents. Tell me something true, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Something you have never told anyone else. Isabella felt her heart hammering against her ribs. I am terrified. Of me? Of this? Of feeling something real for you and discovering it was all performance after all. Of letting myself believe in partnership and finding myself trapped in transaction. Her free hand came up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath expensive wool. Of wanting you despite every rational reason I should protect myself. Isabella. Her name was a prayer and a plea. His free hand rose to cup her face, thumb brushing across her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. I cannot promise you perfection. I cannot promise that I will always know the right thing to say or do. I have been trained since birth to command, to control, to maintain authority at all costs. Breaking those patterns will take time and effort and patience I am not certain I possess. What can you promise me? The truth. Always. Even when it is ugly or uncomfortable or damages my pride. His gaze held hers with an intensity that made her feel like the only person in the world. I can promise that I will listen when you challenge me, value your counsel as I would value my own judgment, and never, never treat you as property, regardless of what role you choose to occupy in my life. And if I choose to occupy no role at all? Pain flickered across his features. Then I will let you go, though it will cost me more than you can possibly imagine. They sat frozen in that moment, faces inches apart, hands joined, the ruined garden silent around them, except for the whisper of wind through dead leaves. Isabella felt the pull between them like gravity, inevitable and terrifying, and utterly beyond her ability to resist. I do not want you to let me go, she whispered. The kiss, when it came, was nothing like the chaste pecks exchanged between properly courting couples under watchful chaperones. It was fierce and honest and tinged with desperation, Roderick's hand sliding into her hair as she gripped his coat. both of them seeking something that had nothing to do with duty or dynasty, and everything to do with the profound recognition of two lonely people who had finally found someone who understood. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Roderick rested his forehead against hers. "This changes everything." "I know. Vivian will be furious. Society will be scandalized. Your reputation is mine to risk," Isabella interrupted firmly. "I am not some fragile ornament that requires protection from my own choices, Roderick. If I kiss you in your mother's garden, it is because I choose to, with full understanding of the consequences." He laughed, the sound surprised and genuine. "You are extraordinary. I am stubborn and opinionated and entirely unsuitable as a duchess." "You are perfect," he corrected, stealing another kiss, this one softer, sweeter. "And I am the fool who nearly lost you, because I sent diamonds instead of honesty." Isabella smiled against his lips. "You can still lose me if you revert to sending jewelry in place of conversation." "Noted." He pulled back enough to look at her properly, his expression serious despite the warmth in his eyes. "No more transactions, Isabella. Only truth." "Only truth," she agreed. They sat together in the dying winter light, hands clasped, the ruins of his mother's garden bearing silent witness to the beginning of something that felt infinitely more solid than ancient stone or inherited titles, a partnership built on honesty, respect, and the courage to choose each other despite every reasonable objection. "Okay, pause. If that garden scene just gave you butterflies, if you felt that moment when Roderick finally broke through his walls and kissed her, then I'm begging you to do something for me. Share this video with one person. Just one. Your friend who loves historical romance, your sister who's obsessed with Bridgerton, that co-worker who reads romance novels on their lunch break. Because here's what breaks my heart. There are thousands of people out there right now searching for a story exactly like this, and they'll never find it because nobody shared it. You have the power to make someone's day by sending them this link. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me if you think they're going to make it. Because what's coming next is devastating. And I need to know you're emotionally prepared. Lady Vivian is about to strike, and everything Roderick and Isabella just built is about to crumble. Don't face it alone. Subscribe so we can suffer through this together. The rumor reached Isabella through her maid, a sweet-faced girl named Anne who had been assigned to attend her during the visit. Anne came to help her dress for dinner on their 4th evening at Winston Abbey, her hands trembling as she fastened the buttons on Isabella's bronze silk gown. "Begging your pardon, miss," Anne whispered, her eyes fixed on her work with unusual intensity. "But I thought you should know what's being said below stairs." Isabella felt ice settle in her stomach. "What is being said, Anne?" The maid's face flushed scarlet. "It's not true, miss. I'm sure of it. But Lady Vivian's maid has been telling anyone who will listen that you and His Grace..." She trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. "That the Duke and I are engaged in an improper relationship," Isabella finished quietly. "That I am his mistress rather than his guest." Anne's silence was confirmation enough. Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the world tilt beneath her feet. Of course. Of course Vivian would strike at her reputation. It was the most effective weapon against a woman of modest standing, and the odd circumstances of Isabella's presence at Winston Abbey provided perfect ammunition. A young lady invited to advise on estate matters, the Duke's obvious preference for her company, the returned necklace that could now be reinterpreted as evidence of a transaction of an entirely different nature. "There's more, miss," Anne said miserably. "Lady Vivian has written to several of her friends in London. The story will be all over town by week's end." Isabella stood slowly, her legs unsteady. She had been a fool. A romantic, naive fool who had believed that honesty and connection could somehow transcend the brutal realities of social position. She had kissed a duke in his garden like some besotted girl from a novel. And now she would pay the price that women always paid when they forgot their place. "Thank you for telling me, Anne," she said, her voice admirably calm despite the panic rising in her chest. "Please have my trunk brought up. I will be leaving first thing in the morning." "Oh, miss, surely His Grace will—" "His Grace cannot undo what has been done," Isabella interrupted. "My reputation is compromised beyond repair. The kindest thing I can do for both of us is to leave before the scandal grows worse." She did not go down to dinner. Instead, she pleaded a headache and spent the evening methodically packing her belongings, each folded garment a small act of self-recrimination. How had she allowed this to happen? She had prided herself on her clear-sightedness, her refusal to be swayed by titles and wealth. And yet she had fallen for Roderick with humiliating completeness, had let herself believe that their connection was somehow different, special, immune to the harsh judgments of society. She was placing the last of her books in her traveling case when the door to her chamber flew open without warning. Roderick stood in the doorway, his face dark with fury, still in his evening clothes from the dinner she had missed. "What is this nonsense about leaving?" he demanded, stepping into the room with complete disregard for propriety. "Your mother just informed me you plan to depart at dawn." Isabella straightened, forcing steel into her spine. "It is not nonsense, Your Grace. It is necessity." "Do not Your Grace me, Isabella. Not after—" He stopped, seeming to notice the packed trunk, the organized chaos of imminent departure. "What has happened?" "What has happened is that I have been reminded of certain fundamental truths about the world we live in." She moved to close the lid of her trunk, needing something to do with her hands. "Lady Vivian has been spreading rumors about the nature of my presence here. By tomorrow, all of London will believe I am your mistress. My reputation will be destroyed, and any association with me will damage yours." His expression shifted from confusion to cold rage. "Vivian did this? Can you blame her? I am a threat to her ambitions, and she has acted to eliminate that threat using the most effective means available. It is what any rational woman in her position would do. It is slander, and I will not tolerate it." He crossed the room in 3 strides, gripping her shoulders. "Isabella, I will make this right. I will provide you with protection, financial security. You need not worry about your future." She pulled away from him as though burned. "Protection? Financial security?" The words tasted of ashes. "Do you hear yourself, Roderick? You sound exactly like a man making arrangements for his mistress." He looked stricken. "That is not what I meant. Is it not?" Tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "What exactly are you offering me? Marriage? Can the Duke of Winston actually marry a woman who has been publicly labeled as his paramour? Or are you offering me a comfortable house somewhere discreet? An allowance generous enough to soothe your conscience while you eventually marry someone like Vivian and produce your legitimate heirs? You are being unreasonable. I am being realistic." The words came out sharper than she intended. "You are still bound by your position, Roderick. By the expectations of your title, your duty to your name. What we shared in the garden was beautiful and honest, but it cannot survive in the real world of social consequences and aristocratic obligations." "So you would simply leave?" His voice had gone dangerously quiet. "You would let Vivian's cruelty dictate your choices?" "I would leave before I become what she has already named me." Isabella turned away, unable to bear the hurt in his eyes. "I will not be your mistress, Roderick, no matter how prettily the arrangement is disguised. And you cannot marry me, not without damaging the very duchy you are sworn to protect. The mathematics are simple, even if the emotions are complicated." "The mathematics," he repeated, something cold entering his tone. "How very rational of you, Miss Shaw. I had not realized our entire relationship was simply a ledger to be balanced." The use of her surname cut deeper than any insult. Isabella forced herself to meet his gaze. "What would you have me do? Stay here and let the rumors grow? Wait patiently while you decide whether your feelings for me are worth the scandal of actually acknowledging them publicly? I am trying to protect you. I do not need your protection." The words burst from her with years of accumulated frustration behind them. "I need your partnership, or I need nothing at all. I told you that from the beginning. I will not be sheltered and managed like some fragile possession that requires careful handling." "Then what do you want from me?" He was shouting now, his famous control finally shattering. "Tell me what you want, Isabella, because I am trying to navigate an impossible situation and you are rejecting every solution I propose." "I want you to choose me." The admission tore from somewhere deep in her chest. "Not because it is convenient or because you can arrange circumstances to minimize scandal. I want you to choose me knowing full well that it will be difficult and controversial, and will require you to defy every expectation that has been placed upon you since birth. But you cannot do that, can you? Because you are still the Duke of Winston first and Roderick second." The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Isabella watched emotions chase across his face, fury, hurt, frustration, and underneath it all, the terrible recognition that she was right. "I need time," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "Time to think, to plan, to determine the best course of action. Time to calculate the costs and benefits." Isabella moved to the door, opening it in clear dismissal. "Take all the time you need, Your Grace. I will be in Bloomsbury, living with the consequences of my choices. You may find me there if you ever decide that I am worth more than careful calculation." He stared at her for a long moment, and Isabella saw the Duke warring with the man in his expression. Finally, he bowed, a gesture so formally correct it felt like a slap, and walked past her into the corridor. "Good night, Miss Shaw," he said without looking back. "I trust you will have a safe journey home." Isabella closed the door behind him and stood with her back pressed against it, listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway. Only when she was certain he was gone did she allow herself to slide down to the floor, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. She had done the right thing, the necessary thing. She had protected herself from becoming a scandal, from being trapped in a position that would slowly corrode her sense of self, regardless of how much affection Roderick claimed to feel. But knowing she had made the right choice did nothing to ease the crushing pain in her chest, or the terrible certainty that she had just walked away from the only person who had ever truly seen her. She would leave at dawn, return to her quiet life in Bloomsbury, and learn to live with the memory of what might have been if society had been kinder, if titles had mattered less, if choosing love had been as simple as choosing truth. Through the window, snow had begun to fall over the Winston Abbey gardens, covering the ruins in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new and utterly false. Isabella woke on Christmas morning to silence. The snow had continued through the night, muffling the world in white, and Winston Abbey felt suspended in time, caught between the scandal of yesterday and whatever uncertain future awaited beyond its walls. She dressed in her traveling clothes, a practical wool dress of deep green, warm but unremarkable, and arranged her hair in a simple knot. The woman in her mirror looked pale and composed. Every inch the respectable gentleman's daughter, preparing to flee before complete ruin, overtook her. Her trunk had been carried down already. One of Roderick's carriages would convey her and her mother back to London immediately after breakfast, a final courtesy that felt more like punishment. Isabella considered skipping the meal entirely, pleading illness and leaving without facing the assembled company. But cowardice had never been her particular failing, and she would not start cultivating it now. The breakfast room was full when she entered, the house guests assembled for the traditional Christmas morning meal. Vivian sat near the head of the table, looking triumphant in rose-colored silk, her victory apparent in every graceful gesture. The other guests murmured in quiet conversations that stopped abruptly when Isabella appeared, their eyes tracking her with the avid curiosity of people witnessing a scandal unfold in real time. Roderick stood near the windows, still as a statue, dressed in stark black that made him look more duke than man. He did not look at her as she entered, his gaze fixed on something in the snow-covered gardens beyond the glass. Isabella took a seat near her mother, who squeezed her hand beneath the table with wordless sympathy. The servants moved through the room with practiced efficiency, filling plates with food that Isabella could not imagine eating. The tension was suffocating, everyone waiting for something, though no one quite knew what. It was Vivian who broke the silence, her voice carrying clearly across the table. "Such a pity you must leave us on Christmas Day, Miss Shaw. Though I suppose under the circumstances, it is for the best." The malice beneath the sympathetic tone was unmistakable. Isabella felt every eye turned toward her, waiting to see how she would respond to this public acknowledgement of her disgrace. Before she could formulate a reply, Roderick moved. He set down his coffee cup with deliberate care and turned from the window, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the assembled company. Then he did something that made every person in the room freeze. He cleared his throat and remained standing, commanding attention through sheer presence alone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of generations of ducal pronouncement, "I have an announcement to make that concerns all of you, but most particularly Miss Isabella Shaw." Isabella's heart stopped. No, he could not do this. Whatever he was planning, it would only make the scandal worse, cement her ruin more thoroughly. She half rose from her seat, intending to flee, but his eyes found hers across the room and held her immobile. "There have been rumors," Roderick continued, "regarding the nature of Miss Shaw's presence at Winston Abbey. Ugly, malicious rumors spread by individuals who mistake cruelty for strategy and power for virtue." Vivian's face had gone white. The dowager leaned forward with intense interest, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I wish to address these rumors directly, so that there can be no misunderstanding about the truth of the situation." He moved away from the window, walking slowly toward the center of the room, toward where Isabella sat frozen in her chair. "Miss Shaw came to Winston Abbey at my invitation to serve as my advisor on matters of estate reform and tenant welfare. This arrangement was, I freely admit, highly unconventional. But Miss Shaw is herself highly unconventional, and I have learned that convention is often simply another word for cowardice dressed in respectability." He stopped a few feet from Isabella's chair, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Determination, yes, but also vulnerability. The same raw honesty he had shown her in the garden. "What the rumors fail to capture," he continued, his voice softening, "is that Miss Isabella Shaw has done me the greatest honor any person has ever bestowed upon me. She refused my power. She demanded my truth. She looked at the Duke of Winston and saw only Roderick, a man who needed guidance and honesty far more than he needed obedience and flattery." "Your Grace," Vivian interjected, her voice sharp with barely controlled panic, Surely this is not the appropriate. Lady Vivian, Roderick said quietly, without even glancing in her direction. You will be silent, or you will leave my house. Those are your only options. The brutal dismissal sent shocked whispers through the assembled guests. Vivian's mouth opened and closed soundlessly before she subsided into furious silence. Roderick returned his attention to Isabella, and the entire room seemed to fade away until there was only him, only this moment, only the choice that hung between them like a held breath. I sent you the Winston star, he said, because I did not know how else to express interest in a woman I had observed but never known. You returned it because you understood, better than I did myself, that it represented everything wrong with how I had been taught to approach marriage and duty. That necklace was used to coerce my mother into an unhappy union. It symbolizes obligation, transaction, the reduction of love to strategic acquisition. He reached into his jacket and withdrew the velvet box, that cursed symbol that had started everything. Then, in a gesture that made several guests gasp audibly, he walked to the fireplace and placed the box on the mantel, turning his back on it with deliberate finality. I reject what the Winston star represents, he said clearly. I reject the notion that my duty to the duchy requires me to marry for anything other than genuine affection and partnership. I reject the social calculations that would value bloodline over character, fortune over integrity, conventional suitability over actual compatibility. He moved back to stand before Isabella, and then, in a movement so shocking that someone dropped their fork with a clatter, the Duke of Winston lowered himself to one knee before her chair. The room erupted in whispered chaos, but Isabella heard none of it. She could see only Roderick, kneeling before her in his perfectly tailored black coat, his proud head bowed in a gesture of humility that no duke should ever have to make. Isabella Marguerite Shaw, he said, and his voice shook slightly, the only sign of his nervousness. I am not asking for your hand in the conventional sense. I am not offering you a position or a title or entry into a social sphere you have never sought. I am asking for your heart, your honesty, your partnership in building a life that serves justice rather than merely preserving tradition. Tears spilled down Isabella's cheeks unchecked. Roderick, I cannot promise that society will be kind to us, he continued. I cannot promise that my peers will accept a duchess who advises on estate reform and speaks her mind without apology. But I can promise that I will choose you every day above duty and expectation and the comfortable lies that men in my position tell themselves to justify loveless marriages. I can promise that I will listen when you challenge me, value your counsel as I value my own judgment, and never, never treat you as anything less than my equal partner. He reached up and took her hand, his grip warm and steady despite the tremor in his voice. Will you marry me, Isabella? Not because I am a duke, not because it will secure your future or elevate your family, but because you believe we can build something true together? Isabella looked down at him, at this powerful man who had humbled himself before an entire room of his social equals, who had publicly rejected centuries of tradition for the chance at genuine connection. She thought of all the rational reasons she should refuse, the scandal, the social consequences, the difficulty of navigating a world that would never fully accept her. But then she thought of his mother's garden, of late nights discussing tenant reforms, of the loneliness in his voice when he spoke of being trapped by his own power. She thought of choosing love over safety, truth over convenience, partnership over transaction. Yes, she whispered. Then louder, stronger. Yes, Roderick, I will marry you. He surged to his feet, pulling her up with him, and then his hands were framing her face, and he was kissing her with passionate intensity, that made mockery of every propriety that should have governed such a moment. Isabella heard scandalized gasps, her mother's happy sob, the dowager's delighted laugh. But none of it mattered because Roderick was kissing her like she was air, and he was drowning. And she was kissing him back with equal fervor, claiming him as publicly and completely as he had just claimed her. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Roderick rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "I should have said it first, before the proposal. But I am still learning how to do this properly." "I love you too," Isabella replied, her hands fisted in his coat to keep herself steady. "And you did it perfectly." He smiled then, genuine and unguarded, and turned to face the assembled company with Isabella tucked against his side, his arm around her waist in a gesture of unmistakable possession and pride. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I present to you the future Duchess of Winston. I suggest you accustom yourselves to her presence, as she will be revolutionizing the management of these estates and likely every other aspect of traditional ducal life." The dowager stood, raising her teacup in a toast. "To Roderick and Isabella," she said warmly. "May they have the happiness my own son denied his duchess." The other guests followed suit with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Vivian had already fled the room, her exit noticed only by the empty chair she left behind. But Isabella barely registered her absence. She was too busy beginning the rest of her life, standing beside a man who had chosen her above everything, who had humbled himself for the chance at truth, who loved her not despite her unconventional nature, but because of it. Outside, snow continued to fall over Winston Abbey, covering the ruins and the grandeur alike in a blanket of white that made everything feel new, clean, full of infinite possibility. The scandal was, as predicted, spectacular. By the evening of Christmas Day, word had spread through the house party guests like wildfire. And by week's end, all of London society was ablaze with the news that the Duke of Winston had proposed to an obscure gentleman's daughter on bended knee before a room full of witnesses, after publicly rejecting the Winston star and humiliating Lady Vivian Northcliffe so thoroughly that she had fled to her family's estate in Scotland. The reactions ranged from shock to outrage to barely concealed delight at such unprecedented drama. Several of Roderick's peers sent strongly worded letters expressing concern about his judgment. 3 distant cousins arrived unannounced to verify that he had not taken leave of his senses. The scandal sheets had a field day with increasingly lurid versions of the story, each more absurd than the last. Roderick read the worst of them aloud to Isabella over breakfast in the Abbey's small private dining room, his tone dry with amusement. "This one claims you bewitched me with radical philosophy and unseemly displays of intelligence. Apparently no duke in his right mind would choose a woman who reads Wollstonecraft." "Clearly I should have stuck to embroidery and watercolors," Isabella replied, stealing a piece of toast from his plate with the casual intimacy of the newly engaged. "Far less threatening to the social order." "Far less interesting to me," he countered, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Though I confess, the accusation of bewitchment is not entirely inaccurate." They had chosen to remain at Winston Abbey through the new year, partly to allow the initial fury to die down, partly because neither of them had any desire to face London society before they absolutely had to. The remaining house guests had departed within days of the proposal, most fleeing as though from a plague ship, though the dowager had stayed on with evident satisfaction, claiming she had not been so entertained in decades. Isabella spent her days working with Roderick on the estate reforms, their plans growing more ambitious with each conversation. They would modernize the tenant cottages, restructure the rental agreements, establish a school for the estate children. It would cost a fortune, and earn them the enmity of every traditional landowner in England. Neither of them cared in the slightest. On the evening before the new year, Roderick found Isabella in the library, their library. She had started thinking of it, curled in her favorite chair with a treatise on agricultural improvements. He carried a small wrapped package, simple brown paper tied with string, utterly unlike the velvet boxes and elaborate presentations typical of ducal gift-giving. "I have something for you," he said, settling into the chair beside hers. "Your actual Christmas gift, though I realize I am several days late." Isabella set aside her book, eyeing the modest package with curiosity. "If it contains diamonds, I am refusing it on principle." "No diamonds," he promised. "I have learned my lesson about expensive gestures." She unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a small antique locket, silver worn soft with age. It was beautiful in its simplicity, the kind of piece that had been treasured for its sentiment rather than its value. When she opened it, she found not a portrait or lock of hair, but a tiny, meticulously hand-drawn map. "The Abbey Gardens," she whispered, recognizing the layout of pathways and fountains rendered in delicate ink. Where I first told you the truth about my mother. Where you first saw me as Roderick rather than the Duke." His voice was quiet, intimate. "Where we chose each other before society or scandal or consequence entered the equation. I wanted you to have something that marked that moment, that reminded us both of where we truly began." Isabella felt tears prick her eyes as she studied the careful detail of the map, the tiny X marked at the stone bench where they had kissed. "You drew this yourself?" "I am a terrible artist, but I tried." He reached over to trace the silver chain. "My mother wore this locket. She left it to me with instructions that I should give it to a woman who loved me for myself rather than my title. I think she would have adored you, Isabella. Your courage, your principles, your refusal to accept anything less than truth." She clasped the locket around her neck, feeling its slight weight settle against her heart. "It is perfect. Far better than any Winston star could ever be." "Good," he said, pulling her from her chair into his lap with the easy possessiveness that had developed between them. "Because the Winston star is being donated to a museum where it can represent history rather than obligation. We will forge our own traditions, starting with lockets instead of diamonds." Isabella looped her arms around his neck, studying the face that had become so dear to her. "Have I told you today that I love you?" "Not in at least 3 hours. I was beginning to worry." She kissed him then, soft and sweet, before resting her head against his shoulder. "I love you, Roderick, even though you have made me the most scandalous woman in England." "Especially because I have made you the most scandalous woman in England," he corrected, his arms tightening around her. "We will weather this storm together and emerge on the other side with something far more valuable than social approval." "And what is that?" "The truth," he said simply, "about who we are, what we value, and what kind of life we want to build." They married in the Abbey's private chapel on a gray January morning, with only immediate family and the dowager in attendance. Isabella wore a simple gown of cream silk, no veil, no elaborate train, just honest elegance that suited her far better than any duchess's finery. Roderick stood waiting for her at the altar in dark blue rather than the traditional black, and when she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, his expression held such open joy that several guests wept. The ceremony was brief, the vows traditional but spoken with fierce sincerity. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Roderick kissed her with passionate intensity that made the poor clergyman cough uncomfortably. And Isabella laughed against his lips, deliriously happy in a way she had never imagined possible. The wedding breakfast was intimate and warm, full of genuine affection rather than social performance. The dowager made a toast about stubborn young people who had the wisdom to choose love over convention. And Isabella's mother cried happy tears, while Harold Shaw looked on with quiet pride at his extraordinary daughter. Years later, on another Christmas morning, Isabella sat in the restored Abbey gardens watching her twin daughters play in the snow. Leonora and Cassandra were 5 years old, dark-haired and gray-eyed like their mother, already showing signs of the same stubborn intelligence that had captivated their father. They were building an elaborate snow fortress, their laughter ringing clear in the cold air. Roderick emerged from the house carrying warm cider, settling beside her on the very bench where they had first kissed. The gardens had been fully restored now, transformed back into the beauty his mother had loved, but improved with modern plantings and design elements that Isabella had chosen. "They are plotting something," he observed, watching their daughters whisper together. "Probably revolution. I blame your influence." "I accept full responsibility," Isabella said, taking the cider with a grateful smile. She wore the silver locket still, every day, a talisman of their beginning. "Though you encouraged it by teaching them about tenant rights and social reform at bedtime." "Fair point." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "Isabella, do you ever regret it? The scandal, the social isolation, the doors that closed because you married me after such spectacular impropriety?" She turned to look at him fully, this man who had humbled himself for her, who had built a life with her based on partnership and truth. "Never. Not once. Do you?" "God, no." He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "But I have been thinking about that first gift, the Winston star that started everything. About how furious I was when you returned it. Your pride was wounded. My pride was shattered," he corrected with a laugh. "But you know what? That moment when you sent back the most valuable thing I could offer, when you rejected my power and demanded my truth instead, that was the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." Isabella felt warmth bloom in her chest. "How so?" "Because you freed me," he said simply, "from the prison of my title, from the assumption that my wealth and power were all that mattered, from the lonely future I was heading toward without even realizing it. You gave me the gift of being seen, Isabella, of being known and loved as Roderick rather than as the Duke. No diamond in the world could ever be worth that." She kissed him then, slow and sweet, tasting cider and contentment. Their daughters squealed with exaggerated disgust at their parents' display of affection, and Isabella broke away laughing. "Come," she said, standing and pulling him to his feet. "Our revolutionaries await. I believe they want you to adjudicate a dispute about snow fortress architecture." "The burdens of fatherhood," he said solemnly, but his eyes sparkled with joy. They walked toward their children hand in hand, the locket catching the winter sun. Two people who had chosen truth over transaction, love over convenience, and in doing so had built something far more precious than any duchy could ever be. A life of genuine partnership, honest affection, and the profound freedom that comes from being loved exactly as you are. Behind them, Winston Abbey stood solid and eternal, no longer a prison of obligation, but a home filled with laughter, love, and the revolutionary idea that even dukes could choose happiness over duty, and find in that choice not diminishment, but the truest form of power, the power to determine one's own fate. My beautiful family, you can see how a woman who refused a duke's diamonds ended up becoming the most unconventional duchess in England. Now listen, if you made it all the way to this ending, if you smiled when Roderick said her rejection was the greatest gift he ever received, if you felt anything during this story and you didn't subscribe, I'm not mad. I'm just disappointed. I'm disappointed because I create these stories every week, pouring research and heart and late nights into crafting romances that actually mean something. And the only way you'll see them is if you subscribe. YouTube won't notify you otherwise. You'll just miss them. Miss the next Duke, the next forbidden love, the next woman who refuses to settle. Is that really what you want? And if this story made you feel something, imagine what it could do for someone else who needs it today. Someone scrolling through their feed, heartbroken or lonely, or just craving a story about choosing truth over convenience. Share this video. Be the reason someone else discovers their new favorite story. Hit that like button so YouTube stops hiding romantic stories that actually have depth. And comment below telling me, would you have returned the Winston star? I read every single comment, and I want to know. Thank you for spending this time with Roderick and Isabella. Until next time, keep choosing truth over transaction, and don't forget to subscribe. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.